Electrical fuses sit in a little gray box in your basement or the hallway closet of practically every house since the early 1900s. And that little box might be the reason two maids became infamous for murder. A fuse has one job. When too much electricity tries to flow through a wire that wasn't built to handle it, the fuse sacrifices itself. It burns out and breaks the circuit. And in doing that one small, unglamorous act, it stops something much worse from happening. A wire overheating inside your house wall, a spark you can't see, and a fire that starts while you're asleep. It is, in the most literal sense, a safety mechanism. It is designed to fail so that your house doesn't burn down and take you with it. But old wiring was never built with the future in mind. A house wired in the early 1900s wasn't wired for hair dryers, radios, electric irons, vacuum cleaners, and all these other new conveniences that were suddenly, in just a span of a couple of decades, showing up in ordinary homes. The wiring was built for a handful of light bulbs, maybe even just like a single appliance, one at a time. And now, all at once, people were starting to ask the same old wiring to carry a modern life. So the fuse system pushed back. The lights would flicker, something would trip. And somewhere in the house, usually at the worst possible moment, everything would just stop. If you lived in the early 20th century, this was not some rare one in a million inconvenience. It was as common as a leaky faucet or a sticky door. Families across Europe and America dealt with it constantly. You'd be in the middle of ironing a shirt or reading by lamplight or listening to the radio, and the whole house would just go dark. You'd sigh, you'd feel your way to the fuse box, and you'd swap the fuse out, and then life would go on. A blown fuse was, at its absolute worst, an annoyance. Sure, it could leave you in the dark or stop your ironing dead in the middle of a crease. It could interrupt your evening, ruin a load of laundry, delay your dinner while someone fumbled around in the dark cellar looking for a replacement fuse. That's it, though, really. That's the ceiling of what a blown fuse is supposed to do to your life. It's not supposed to be the reason two people end up dead. It is not supposed to be the moment where an ordinary household frustration, the kind of thing happening in thousands of homes on any given evening in any given city, quietly tips over into something so violent, so savage, that the people who found the bodies would never be able to describe it without their voice changing. And yet, on a cold February evening in Le Mans, France, in the Lancelin family home, a fuse blew. Somewhere in that house, something else was already moving. Something that had been building for years, in silence, behind the careful, obedient faces of two women who were about to become infamous. By the time the lights came back on, the people of Le Mans were left with a horror they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. This is part 2 of the Papin Sisters story, the maids who let a power outage end in brutal murder. In part 1, we saw the romantic drama between the Papin sisters' parents and how time and again their mother chose her own needs above her children's. How the girls found their way back to each other after separation, grew closer, and how their mother, unable to stop controlling them even as adults, kept uprooting their lives the moment they found any footing. From abandonment into control, managing their work, their wages, and their lives. If you haven't seen part 1, please go watch it first. The English sources on this case are almost universally surface level. The crime, the verdict, the spectacle. But when you start to get into the French material, something shifts a little bit. You start to see the texture underneath. Small details, quiet patterns, things that don't make the headlines, but that make everything that comes next feel less like a shock and more like a portrait of two women that the world around them never bothered to actually see, until, of course, it was far too late. So Christine Papin walks through the door of 6 Rue Bruyère in Le Mans in April 1926, hired as a live-in cook for the Lancelin family. The family rented the home from a physician named Louise Chartier. And you might be wondering the same thing I did. Why was this super wealthy family renting a home? Why didn't they own it? Actually, as it turns out, completely normal for the time. Before World War II, renting wasn't a sign of financial struggle in France. It was simply what most people did, including the wealthy. Homeownership nationally sat below 35% even as late as the 1950s. And after World War I, rental laws that had been adopted during the conflict were extended into interrural period, effectively freezing the real estate market and making buying property complicated, illiquid, and frankly unattractive, even for families who could have afforded it outright. Wealthy families of this era preferred to keep their capital in bonds and investments rather than tied up in property. But there was also a cultural dimension to it too. In the bourgeois France, how you lived mattered far more than whether you owned where you lived. A beautiful townhouse on a respectable street was a status symbol, regardless of whose name was on the deed. Renting the right address in the right neighborhood said everything that needed to be said. The husband and father, René Lancelin, is a retired and honorary solicitor, and that honorary part matters more than it might seem. When René stepped back from active legal practice in 1919, he didn't simply become a private citizen living off his savings. He kept the title, which in bourgeois Le Mans meant he kept the weight of it, the social credibility, the professional respect, the way people addressed him in a room. Honorary solicitor wasn't a formality. It was a signal that this was a man of standing and, by extension, a household of standing. After he retired, René pivots to business by joining insurance mutual company boards as an executive. He was one of the important people in the room, making decisions about how the company's money was managed and invested. The problem is that position comes with a lot of access to other people's money. And later, the question of what exactly René had been doing with that access became a very uncomfortable one. So both he and his wife, Madame Léonie Lancelin, were both 56 years old. They shared a daughter named Genevieve, who was 21 years old at the time of Christine's boarding. The Lancelins' other daughter, Madeleine, was 25 years old, married, and already out of the house living her adult life. The Lancelin home is located in an upscale neighborhood and is typical for a bourgeois family. And Madame Lancelin would expect nothing less than perfection in the upkeep of it. She would tell new hires, "I wish to warn you that I will not tolerate any familiarity. This is an absolute rule that must not be broken in this house. Furthermore, I expect to be your sole point of contact. You are not to address any other members of the family. Finally, your purchases must not exceed the bound of reason." Madame Lancelin was no stranger to managing domestic staff. Over 30 years, she had employed 5 different maids before the Papin sisters ever walked through her door. Each one had left for ordinary reasons, by all accounts: marriage, aging parents back home, the usual rhythms of a woman's life in that era. And yet, Madame Lancelin maintained written correspondence with every single one of them long after they'd gone. She took pride in this. To her, those letters were proof of something, that she was a fair employer, a reasonable woman, someone her staff remembered fondly enough to keep in touch with, that the relationships she built in her own home were ones worth preserving. One housekeeper by the name of Elise Baron stated about her time working for the Lancelin family from July 1903 to January 1907, she said, "I was always satisfied with Mr. and Mrs. Lancelin. I have nothing but praise for the way she gave me instructions regarding my work or when she offered observations," which, moreover, happened only very rarely. Christine Papin was no different in that Madame explained the same expectation, and she would earn 250 francs a month. Christine knew the high expectations of Madame Lancelin, and she had to prove herself as competent before she introduced the idea of Léa coming to live and work for the Lancelin home, which she did. In the following year, her wages were raised to 300 francs, plus a New Year's bonus of about 125 francs. They were especially appreciative of Christine's delicious cooking and dining room services. And paying her dues and biding her time in this way worked. Less than a year later, in February 1927, Madame Lancelin agreed to hire Léa for 250 francs a month. Léa was also made aware, like any employee, of Madame's expectations. But she was also much more shy and intimidated than Christine. The Lancelins perceived Léa as having a limited intellect, accepting observations without a word, and performing her duties mechanically, never engaging her employers in conversation. She spoke softly, never a word raised in anger. Léa was also wary about the demanding nature of the work, given that Madame checked every single task closely. Christine said, She subjects everything to inspection, and the slightest speck of dust draws comments, along with reminders of similar instances. Madame might also say, "Christine, pay attention. The butcher and grocery bills are running too high." Then suggest she cook something using leftovers. French households of this era ran tight domestic accounts, regardless of income. It wasn't about need, it was about control and principle. Letting servants overspend on groceries was seen as poor household management, a reflection on Madame's competence as mistress of the house. The bill wasn't the point. The standard was. And if you're wondering about this maybe being the same standard as Louise Monnier in that series, it isn't. Louise Monnier was in a category entirely of her own, a woman so pathologically tight-fisted she couldn't justify the cost of soap or basic care for her children. The Lancelins weren't cruel or frugal misers in this way. Madame Lancelin, watching the butcher bills, was less about deprivation and more about control. The very bourgeois belief that a well-run household was a moral statement. But in any case, Christine and Léa were conscientious and tidy, never balking at orders or complaining about their employers. But where Léa was regarded as having a limited intellect and engagement, and that Christine made her work way too hard for just a teenage girl, Madame also noticed that she could not criticize Christine too much, or her temper was quick to flare up. Despite this, plus the sisters' sullen nature, Madame overlooked these things because, in her view, the sisters were gems of servants, and they were not inclined to small talk, which suited her just fine. It seemed by all appearances that the Papin sisters were content in their employment. The Lancelins were content in their employees. According to the Lancelins, the Papin sisters, who had everything they needed, and even the superfluous, at our home, since we never made any distinction between how masters and servants were to be treated, the same table, no restrictions on drink, and full participation in anything that might contribute to that abundance. They enjoyed complete freedom regarding their duties and accepted household customs. The cook would go out every day for supplies and would stay out for an hour and a half, without anyone ever having made a remark to her. Christine's perspective? Outside of our duties, the masters were somewhat distant with us. Mr. Lancelin never spoke to me, nor did Miss Lancelin, Genevieve. Only Madame spoke to me to offer observations and at times reproaches that were more or less justified. The days were scheduled, consistent, and never altered. Mr. Lancelin's brother-in-law, Raoul, heard Madame once say, "I issue her orders in the morning and hand Christine the necessary funds. I rarely spoke to her again for the remainder of the day." As for the chambermaid Léa, who naturally spent more of her time within the living quarters, orders were given to her as the need arose, and I never heard the slightest complaint from her. And it appears the Lancelin held a great deal of trust in their maids, as they went away on holiday during the summers while the sisters looked after the house alone. Throughout the remaining part of the year, though, the rhythm of the house was dictated by the Lancelins' social engagements. The work schedule left little time for relaxation, but they were able to have some time together to do their sewing. René Lancelin said, "Christine did not wax the floors, nor did she wash them. Thus, she had 2 hours at her disposal in the afternoon." So together with Léa, they sewed for themselves. Plus, they had time off on Sundays after the midday meal, assuming the Lancelins were not entertaining that night. Mr. Lancelin also said, "On Sundays, we avoided having anyone over for dinner so as to leave them the day free." Sundays, as we know, the sisters spent together in visiting their mother. But Clémence is still doing Clémence things at this point. She begins pushing the Lancelins for higher wages, or threatens to pull her daughters from the household entirely if they don't comply. This is nothing new, right? And I am certain that no wage would have truly reflected the reality of 14-hour workdays with barely half a Sunday to call their own. But let's also be honest about what this actually was. Clémence wasn't advocating for her daughters, I don't think. She was negotiating for herself, the way she always has, squeezing every franc she could out of anyone she could bully or maneuver and pocketing the difference. But this time, something shifted because Christine would not budge, stating, "I remained in that place where, all in all, we were treated and fed quite well." While it would not have been appropriate for there to be familiarity or informality between the Lancelins and the Papin sisters, there are several sources that claim the sisters had felt a fondness and respect towards Madame. that they secretly and privately called her maman, the word for mother in French. But I could not fully verify this. And even if it is true, I couldn't work out whether maman was genuine sentiment, a term of endearment from two women who had never really had one and saw one in their madame, or something far more loaded, perhaps, a quiet, private callback to the narcissistic, demanding, selfish woman who had been their actual mother, the one who took everything and gave back just enough to keep them compliant. Tell me what you think about that in the comments. It's 1928. Léa has been in the Lancelin home for just over a year now, Christine for 2. And Léa's in the living room working her way through the afternoon clean. She's quietly and methodically wiping down the same surfaces and corners and returning the same objects to their positions day after day. It's the same thing. And then Madame comes in and eyes something across the floor. There, a small scrap of paper. Barely anything really. I mean, enough Léa is not even picking it up or noticing it. But Madame crosses the room without a word, and then in smooth, almost casual motion, she reaches out and takes the flesh of Léa's shoulder between her finger and thumb and pinches hard. And long enough where Léa's knees buckle to the floor. Madame says, "There's a piece of paper," and then walks out. And then, of course, later that evening, when everything's done and the sisters are in the room together, Léa tells Christine what happened. She's still really unsettled by it, and you can hear it in how she says it, the disbelief sitting just under her anger. "Can you believe it, Christine? What she did to me? It's not like her. She better not do it again, or I'll defend myself." And Christine, without hesitation, says, "You're right, Léa. We mustn't let ourselves be pushed around. The bosses shouldn't treat us like that." And something about this exchange feels significant in retrospect because there is Christine and Léa agreeing on something important, that they have a line and that crossing it has consequences. This incident was seemingly out of character. She said it herself, and by all accounts, quickly forgotten. Madame did not have a history of mistreating her staff, and you can see that even the sisters were shocked by it. So why such an out of character response to a small piece of paper on the floor? Even Madame's brother, Albert Ringard, although most likely biased, said, "To the best of my knowledge, my sister was utterly incapable of an act of violence. She was a timid and fearful person. She viewed Léa as a little girl barely out of childhood, someone to whom it was difficult to convey instructions. Not out of ill will, but rather out of mental laziness. It is conceivable that in her dealings with Léa, in order to get her to carry out a command, Madame Lancelin might have proceeded just as one would with a child, that, if need be, she may have taken her by the arm, using gestures to indicate what she wanted her to do." One possibility worth considering, I think, is, and this is speculation, not documented fact, is that 1928 may have been when René's business ventures on those insurance boards first started showing signs of strain. The mutual insurance companies René sat on the boards of were heavily invested in regional real estate and local business loans, exactly the kind of assets that looked rock solid in the mid-1920s during the first half of his business expansion, but started to quietly wobble before the 1929 crash. Dividend payments to policyholders were becoming harder to meet. The investments weren't generating the returns they projected, but the companies had already promised policyholders a certain dividend, essentially a profit share, based on those project returns. And when the returns fell short, the money to pay those dividends had to come from somewhere else. And that somewhere else was usually new policyholder premiums coming in, using this fresh money to pay obligations from old money. This works temporarily, but is essentially a house of cards. The moment growth slows or claims spike, the whole structure becomes unsustainable. So board members were being pressured to find creative accounting solutions to paper over the shortfalls, which is a polite way of saying the books were being manipulated. And in a provincial city like Le Mans, where everyone knows everyone, whisper networks were already starting to circulate doubts about the soundness of certain investments. René knew. And if René knew, Leonie knew. And for a woman whose entire identity and sense of self rested on the assumption that the Lancelin household was exactly what it appeared to be, that kind of knowledge would have been its own kind of slow poison. It makes sense that things at home were tense. And it makes sense to me that something in Leonie started to shift. To understand what was currently happening to René Lancelin's finances, we need to back up a few years. And I think this is important to see where the tension may have been coming from in the Lancelin home. Throughout the 1920s, something genuinely new was happening with money. For most of human history, investing in stocks and markets was something only the very wealthy did, because it required connections, capital, and a level of financial sophistication most ordinary people simply didn't have. But the 1920s changed that. After World War I, the American economy was booming. Companies were growing fast. New technologies like cars, radios, and electrical appliances were emerging, and their stocks were making early investors rich. Word spread, and newspapers wrote about it, and neighbors talked about it. And for the first time, ordinary middle-class people started buying shares in companies, often borrowing money to do it, betting that prices would keep climbing, and for a while they did. The Dow Jones, which is the main measure of American stock market health, shot up 540% between 1921 and 1929. People who had invested modestly early on were suddenly wealthy, which made more people invest, which pushed prices higher, which made even more people invest. It was a bubble. The entire thing rested on one assumption, that prices would keep going up. Not because the companies were actually worth that much, just because everyone agreed to keep acting like they were. And that's the thing about that kind of agreement. It holds up perfectly right up until the moment it pops. By late October 1929, that bubble popped. Belief in the system cracked. And here's why. Several large, sophisticated investors who understood what they were looking at started quietly selling their shares. They could see that the stock prices had climbed far beyond what the companies were actually worth. They wanted out before the inevitable correction and loss of money. But when large investors sell, other investors notice, and then they panic. Because if the smart money is leaving, something must be wrong. So they sell too, which drives prices down further, which panics more people, which drives prices down even further still. October 24th, 1929 would become known as Black Thursday. A record 12.9 million shares were traded as everyone scrambled to get out simultaneously. The market didn't just decline, it collapsed. Fortunes that had existed on paper that morning were gone by the afternoon. France didn't feel this impact immediately, and that's actually what made it worse for people like René. The French economy was initially insulated from the American crash, which gave French investors and executives a false sense of security well into 1930. They watched America burn and thought, it's not us. Our investments are in local businesses, regional bonds, and provincial insurance companies. We're fine. Everything's fine. They were not fine. The depression spread because the global economy was more interconnected than anyone had really fully understood. American banks called in loans to European businesses. International trade collapsed. French regional businesses that had seemed rock solid started failing. And the investments those provincial insurance companies, the ones René sat on the boards of, had made in those businesses, just completely gone. By 1931, the sneaky paper trail of what had been done to keep those companies looking solvent, those fictitious dividends and falsified accounts, was impossible to ignore now that a massive magnifying glass was being held up to them. René was proverbially screwed. By the end of August 1931, René was implicated in a major banking scandal and sued for fraudulent accounting and dividend schemes by over 700 small shareholder plaintiffs. And the Lancelin legal troubles would drag on far beyond the murders of his wife and daughter. Backing up just a couple of months, it's autumn 1929, and in the over 2 years that Léa and Christine have been employed at the Lancelins, the family had witnessed explosive, possibly violent scenes between the sisters and their mother Clémence. Madame said, the mother apparently wanted to continue collecting her daughter's wages. We stated that we did not wish to get involved. It got to a point where Madame told the sisters, ensure that your mother no longer comes to fetch you at our home. And the sisters listened, at least as far as they could control. But then here she comes anyway on a random Wednesday. Clémence rings the doorbell at 6 Rue Bruyère, unannounced and seemingly unaware of boundaries. Madame answers and Clémence says, I would like to speak to my daughters. They really ought to come and see their uncle and aunt who are passing through Le Mans. Madame's response is pointed. Look here, Madame Derrier. We find it rather disruptive when you come demanding them like this, and besides, they've just stepped out. So Clémence leaves on hearing her daughters aren't home, and she walks back toward the train station. And that's when she sees them, Christine and Léa, sitting on a bench not far from the house at all, just sitting there, quietly, together, waiting for something, apparently. Waiting, it turns out, for their mother to pass. The realization settles over Clémence slowly. Her daughters knew she was there. They had slipped out of the house, found a bench close enough to see the door, and sat down to wait her out. Not really hiding exactly, just not available, and not for her anyway. So Clémence walks past them, and they see her. She sees them, and nobody says very much. And upon realizing what happened, Clémence just keeps walking. Clémence will later say that she didn't really fully understand what happened. And this is the first sign that something had begun to change, that she chalked it up to just an odd day or a mood or whatever. But this would not be the first time something like this would happen. On the second Sunday of October 1929, the wind was bitterly cold, and thus no one was really out and about walking on the windy streets of Le Mans. Up to this point, the sisters were visiting their mother on Sundays. But it was 4 p.m. It would start to get dark soon, and she was getting impatient. So she left her home and set out towards the Lancelin house. But on the way, she bumps into Madame and her daughter Genevieve on the cross street and says, do you happen to know if my daughters are indeed coming to see me this Sunday? And Madame says, they are just about to leave. Don't be impatient, Madame Derrier. They are on their way. So Clémence continues towards the Lancelin home, just a minute's walk down the street, just as her two daughters were stepping out of the house. Christine and Léa see their mother and say, you know, this morning we saw a lady who looked just like you. Goodbye, Mom. Then they just crossed the street and headed towards the cathedral without another word. Clémence, of course, is just standing there stunned, unable to make sense of this. What happened and how differently her daughters are acting these days. And her daughters would refuse to see Clémence again from that day forth. Clémence said, I wrote to them many times. They never replied. I never understood why. I don't think she's lying. I think she genuinely, completely did not understand. And that's almost more infuriating than if she had understood, I think. Because a person who has spent decades treating their children as extensions of their own needs rather than as separate people with interior lives genuinely cannot compute no contact as a rational response to their own behavior. Because to understand why your children cut you off, you have to be able to see yourself from the outside. You have to be able to ask, what did I do? And sit with a very uncomfortable answer. Christine had voiced that Clémence, quote, had nothing kind to say to me or my sister. She constantly reproached us, was unpleasant toward us, and whenever she saw us, it was only to heap criticism upon us, particularly regarding our grooming and attire. And Léa's sentiment was similar, stating, my mother exasperated me with the remarks she constantly made. And on the other side of that silence toward Clémence, I think, for the first time in their lives, Christine and Léa had something that felt like stability. Same address and same routine, day after day, year after year. And a woman at the head of it who, at least in those early years, praised their work and ran her home with the kind of quiet, consistent authority that Christine and Léa had been chasing their whole lives. And every parental figure they'd ever known, really. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. And I think when you finally have solid ground under your feet for the first time and have something worth protecting, it becomes possible to recognize the thing that was destabilizing you the entire time. You don't go no contact with a toxic parent when you have nothing. You go no contact when you have finally something to lose. Clemence wrote them letters, but her daughters never replied, and she continued to do so for a couple of years too. I think there are 2 letters Clemence sent her daughters that are worth noting. See if you can spot the narcissistic manipulation and send it in the comments before you hear my particular opinionated take on it. February 3rd, 1931. My 2 dear daughters, I am writing to ask for news of you. If you are able to send word, I would be overjoyed to receive it. My heart will never forget you, not until my very last breath. If the life you currently lead no longer brings you happiness, come back to me. My heart will always welcome you home. If circumstances prevent you from reuniting with me right now, come back to me at a later time, and I would be overjoyed to hold you close to my heart. If you no longer have my address, write to the family in Saint-Mars-du-Til, and they will always know where I am working. If you are in need of money, write to me, and I will send you some immediately. In this life, no one ever knows what lies ahead. God exists, certainly, but people play a significant role in shaping our lives, above all, through the jealousy they harbor towards you and me. In any case, do whatever you feel is best. We often believe we have friends only to find that they are, in fact, our greatest enemies, even those closest to us. Would you be willing to write to your grandmother in Saint-Mars? She would be so happy to receive a note from her 2 granddaughters. I close by sending you my heartfelt love. Your mother, Clémence Derrier, 61 Rue Premature. I'll await your reply. Christine and Léa. My heart will never forget you, not until my very last breath. Classic narcissistic framing, in my opinion. Immediately centers her own feelings rather than asking how her daughters are or acknowledging that anything was wrong in the first place between them. The dramatic last breath language is emotional escalation designed to produce guilt. If the life you currently lead no longer brings you happiness, come back to me. I don't hear her saying, I miss you. I want to repair things. She's saying, when your life falls apart, you'll be here. She's planting a seed of doubt, I think, about the sister's current happiness while positioning herself as the safety net. And the implication of that is like, your life without me won't work out. You'll need me eventually. God exists, certainly, but people play a significant role in shaping our lives, above all, through the jealousy they harbor towards you and me. This feels extremely revealing. Clemence is suggesting that a third, unnamed party is jealous of both of them and has poisoned the relationship. She's reframing the sisters' deliberate choice to cut contact as something that was done to them by outside forces. This removes her own responsibility entirely and positions her as a fellow victim alongside her daughters. Classic deflection, nothing is ever their fault. There's always an external villain. I think she's talking about Madame Lancelin, the woman who, in Clemence's mind, had stolen something that belonged to her, which, if you recall, is exactly what she did with Gustave and Amelia. You'll remember from part 1 that Clemence couldn't tolerate the closeness between Gustave and his eldest daughter. And her response then was the same as it is now, not self-reflection or curiosity, but rather resentment, jealousy of anyone who takes up space in the hearts of people she considers hers. If you are in need of money, write to me and I will send someone immediately. This line just rewrites history full stop, and the audacity is breathtaking. This is a woman who arguably abandoned her children, then spent years intercepting her daughter's wages while continuing to change, moving them from home to home like chess pieces when it benefited her financially. Their needs and desires being completely besides the point. She builds to the money offer after softening them up with guilt and conspiracy theories. And the offer to send money right away implicitly reframes herself as a generous mother, erasing the years of financial extraction entirely. Even the suggestion that Clemence has money available and is willing to send it plants a seed. What if things do get too hard or they do need something? Now there's a number to call. A door left open, on her terms though, of course. Would you be willing to write to your grandmother? When the direct appeal isn't working, expand the guilt network, right? Now it's not just Clemence who's hurt, it's the grandmother too. How could you do this to us ladies? I'll await your reply, Christine and Léa. Not, I love you or I hope you're well, a statement of expectation. She's still in management mode, even in a letter to estranged daughters. Am I reading too much into this letter? Maybe, but I can't get past what's missing from it. There's absolutely no acknowledgement that anything was wrong in the first place. No recognition that her daughters didn't just drift away. They made a deliberate, considered choice to leave and never look back. Instead, what we get is poor me, poor grandmother, someone out there jealous of us. My love is eternal. Here is some money if you need it. And I'll be here waiting for you the moment your life just falls apart so you can come home. It reads less like a mother reaching out to her daughters and more like a woman who has rewritten the story so completely in her own mind that she genuinely believes she's the wronged party. Tell me what you think in the comments. Another revealing letter dated March 5th, 1931 says, "My dear little girls, do not worry about my health. I'm doing well and I still believe that you will return to my heart. I am still counting on the two of you despite a painful sorrow. I have been told that every effort is being made to force you into a convent to become nuns. You had always told me that you would never retreat into a convent, that such a life did not align with your views. I know your views well. They are truly honorable. To maintain together or else to marry and raise a beautiful family. I know that both of you have a great love for children. I will never accept such a thing. It is not God's will. It is a violation of God's law. It will bring them no good fortune. But here is my final wish. I am not, well, as you know, I believe in God, but in God alone. And so here it is. I shall never be buried by priests. That is final. And God will not hold it against me. It is a violation of God's law to force two young girls to enter a convent. We ask nothing of anyone. It is your own jealousy at work. There is jealousy directed at both you and me. Do not submit to this. Fight until the very last moment. Your mistress is well aware of the situation. I know that those wretched people, I will never set foot in a Catholic church again. It is Catholics who are forcing you to do this. I was just told as much. My children, you are honest souls. Do not fear the law. My heart will always be open to receive you. They have alienated you from your mother so that you would remain blind to what they were doing to you, to the misery they have been inflicting upon you for the past 6 months. My family will always welcome you. Come back if you can, and do not feel beholden to your employers. God would never condone locking up two young girls simply because of their beliefs. The more honest one is, the more miserable one becomes among Catholics. Leave. Go to the countryside as quickly as possible for the sake of your health. Do not worry about the cost. They are trying to break you down so they can gain complete control over you. They will send you to the hospital where you will end up paying a far higher price. And once there, they will do whatever they please with you. Leave. Otherwise, you will no longer be your own masters. They will force you into just any convent. Do not give your 2 weeks' notice. Go to the countryside. Look up the René family. They are a good family. It won't cost you much, and you will have fresh milk and clean air. Have courage. It is my heart speaking to you now, not merely my voice. Whew. In my opinion, this is almost certainly a paranoid invention on Clemence's part, an unhinged one at that. There is no credible evidence anyone was forcing or pressuring Christine and Léa into a convent. What was actually happening is something Clemence's ego could not accept. The sisters had gone silent, stopped responding and visiting, and Clemence, unable to accept that her daughters made this choice freely, needed an external explanation. So she constructed one. Someone must be forcing them. Catholics? Their employers? These jealous people she keeps mentioning? A conspiracy of unnamed villains actively working to steal her daughters from her. The first letter was controlled manipulation, guilt, money, offers, performed vulnerability. This one is unraveling. The language is more frantic, paranoid, and scattered, and like I said, unhinged. She jumps from the convent to her burial wishes to Catholics to leaving immediately to fresh milk in the countryside. This reads like someone's grip on the narrative is slipping. There's a lot in this letter, but a few things I pulled out. First of all, tell me yours in the comments, what you pulled out. I am still counting on the two of you despite a painful sorrow, still centering herself and performing martyrdom. They have alienated you from your mother so that you would remain blind. Classic narcissistic reframing, positioning herself as the only one who truly sees the situation. Do not feel beholden to your employers, directly targeting the Lancelins, the stability the sisters have found, the thing Clémence just can't compete with. Leave, go to the countryside, escalating to direct instruction, back in management mode again. My heart speaks to you, not merely my voice. Performed emotional sincerity at the close, just like in the first letter. But whether Christine saw the same things in this letter or in these letters, I'm not sure. But there was something that did land for her when she read this particular letter. At the very top of the letter, written upside down, almost like an afterthought, Clemence wrote, "In 3 days, my Christine, will turn 26 years old." And I think this stood out to Christine for a couple of reasons. One, 26 years old was the same age that Clémence had given birth to Christine. But more immediately, it made Christine realize the passage of time. If she was turning 26, it meant that Léa was still just 19 years old. Whether it was in general or because her mother's letters appeared to be increasingly unhinged, the fear that Clémence could sweep in at any moment and take Léa away legally chilled her. You'll recall that legal age comes at 21. So Christine feels she needs to do something to safeguard Clémence having the same realization and using her maternal power over Léa. Christine sought out emancipation for Léa, stating that she wished for Léa to enjoy greater freedom and to have full control over her own money. Emancipation is a formal process where a young person, usually through a court, gets recognized as a legal adult before reaching the standard age, 21 in this case. And once emancipated, the parent loses all legal authority over them. They can sign contracts, make their own decisions, keep their own wages, live where they choose, etc. What happened with Christine's emancipation or quest isn't fully documented, but no record of legal emancipation makes sense when you consider the circumstances. Léa was already living independently, receiving her wages directly, had a savings account, and already living a life Clémence had no practical access to. A court looking at that picture would have found very little reason to grant formal emancipation. She was already free as far as they were concerned. Something was going on between the time the sisters cut off Clémence in the winter of 1931 and the fall of 1931. The sisters became even more withdrawn, sullen, and tense. And some said they stopped leaving the home unless they were required to, and stopped venturing out altogether on Sundays like they used to, and just retreated to their room alone for the downtime. Maybe at first the freedom from Clémence was relief. But as the months went on, I think it turned into a feeling of a void. People who maybe haven't experienced something like this assume that cutting off a toxic parent is liberating. And it can be eventually, but in the immediate aftermath, especially for people who have been enmeshed with a controlling parent their entire lives, the silence is destabilizing in ways that feel physical, palpable. Clémence wasn't just their mother. She was, in a very real sense, the organizing force of their entire existence. Every job change, every placement, every wage negotiation, and of course, every Sunday visit, all of it revolved around her gravity. So even resisting her required constant energy. Hating her required energy, and worrying about what she'd do next required energy. And when that stops, when the letters go unanswered and the visits stop coming, there's suddenly this enormous amount of psychological space that has no content in it. And that space doesn't feel like freedom right away. It feels like something is wrong or missing, something empty and scary. I don't think the nervous system immediately understands that the threat has been neutralized. It stays alert and keeps scanning. And that scanning is exhausting in a way that looks from the outside like depression or withdrawal or just being tired all the time. And for Christine and Léa, who had no framework for understanding what they were feeling and who were living in an attic room with no one to talk to but each other, that void would have been enormous. And the notice behaviors sort of folding in on themselves. I think there's signs of two women whose nervous systems are working overtime with no outlet. And further, Christine specifically had always defined herself through her relationship to Léa, protecting her, watching over her, and being the steady one. But cutting off Clémence also meant cutting off the primary threat that had organized Christine's protective instincts in the first place. Without Clémence to fight, what was Christine protecting Léa from? The answer, increasingly, was the Lancelin household, the only other source of stress in their sealed-off world, which meant all that vigilance and protective energy had nowhere left to go but inward, into the attic room, into each other, into a silence that was becoming its own kind of pressure cooker, right alongside a madame downstairs whose depression was quietly worsening, fed by the slow burn of her husband's financial scandals and the creeping terror of what it might do to the Lancelin name. It's the end of August 1931, and the sisters are sitting in the Le Mans mayor's office. Arsène Lefebvre noticed that the sisters were agitated. This would be literally right around the time when René's legal problems began, but it's unclear to me if that is connected to what's about to happen in the mayor's office right now. Something is off. Fuvre can feel it the moment they walk in. There's an agitation to them, to Christine especially, that makes him uncomfortable enough to quietly call in his general secretary, Jules Bourgeois, just in case. Christine does the talking, and Léa doesn't say a word. She just nods, steady and silent, every time her sister makes a point. And Christine has a lot of points to make. The Lancelins, she says, are persecuting them. And if the mayor won't intervene and help them right now, then he is just as responsible for what's being done to them. She's worked up. Fuvre keeps his voice measured, calm, the practiced neutrality of a man who handles difficult situations for a living. He doesn't want this to escalate. He wants them out of his office. Go see Commissioner Dupuy, he says. There's not much I can do for you. So both Fuvre and his assistant watch the sisters leave town hall, and his assistant says, "You can clearly see that they are worm-eaten." This is a literal translation for a metaphor that functions almost like an idiom in French. It describes wood hollowed out from the inside by worms, solid looking on the surface, crumbling underneath. Apply it to a person, it functions as either a cutting insult about character, like someone deemed corrupt, untrustworthy, and morally rotten, or a dismissal of someone seen as mentally deteriorated, worn down, and broken by life. When the town hall secretary said it about Christine and Léa walking out of that building, he almost certainly meant both. Fuvre calls the chief of police, Alain Dupuy, immediately to give him a heads up that the sisters were on their way to come see him. He basically told Dupuy, "These sisters came in making accusations. Christine is claiming I'm harming them by not intervening. Please go find out what's going on with them." As expected, the chief of police welcomed the sisters into his office just 10 minutes later. But rather than investigating the sisters' grievances against the Lancelins, which was the whole point of their visit to the mayor in the first place, Dupuy launched an investigation into the sisters themselves, essentially turning their complaint into surveillance of them. And of course, they found nothing criminal, but Dupuy did gather a very detailed portrait of two women who had essentially disappeared from public life. No friends, no rare outings, practically invisible on the street, and withdrawn for 2 years since late 1929. Local shopkeepers, neighbors, and family all confirm the same thing. So again, this is the end of August, and most likely right before René's legal troubles hit the proverbial fan, and the Lancelin family are returning from their summer vacation. Remember, they have full trust in the sisters and leave them in the summer to tend to the house. Once they are home, the chief commissioner decides to tell René about the sisters' complaint to the mayor and in turn the police. But he also said there was something abnormal about those girls, that they believed themselves to be persecuted. He ends by saying, If I may say so, Monsieur Lancelin, were I to have servants of that sort, I wouldn't keep them for very long. And now, on paper, that's just a commissioner doing his job, right? A complaint came in, he's relaying it, but he's also not saying, let's look into what they said about the Lancelins, or something else like, let's check if there's any truth to these allegations. The starting assumption from the police official, no less, is that the girls are the abnormal ones, that the persecution is imagined, that the problem here is their perception, not whoever might be doing the persecuting. And maybe that instinct isn't unreasonable on its own. Maybe you do want to establish whether a complaint is credible before you go accusing a prominent local family of something. That's fair, and maybe how you'd want any investigation to start. I don't know. But nobody ever investigated the Lancelins or these claims, like full stop. Nobody sits Monsieur or Madame down and asks, did you mistreat these girls? Is there anything that led to this? Anything valid about these complaints? The inquiry starts and ends with the sisters, their credibility, their mental state, whether they're the abnormal ones, and it never once turns around to ask the same questions of the people they were accusing. That's a decision about whose word matters by default and whose doesn't. This is the kind of privilege the Papin sisters could never have dreamed of having. Not wealth, protection, the built-in assumption that when your name is Lancelin, you don't get questioned, you get believed. And when your name is Papin, you don't get investigated, you get diagnosed. In any case, René responds, I do not deny that they are a bit peculiar, but as far as their work goes, they give us complete satisfaction. We have absolutely no grounds to dismiss them. And to the commissioner, it really seems that René has placed his absolute trust in his maids, so he presses on the matter no further. If this were any other story, that's where it would end. A workplace grievance handled quietly, forgotten within the month. But it's not any other story. Because right now, in this moment, trust intact, complaint dismissed, René standing by the women who cook his meals and press his shirts and turn down his bed at night, nobody in that house has any idea how little time they actually have left. The sisters go back to their routine, and the Lancelins go back to theirs. And somewhere between this ordinary afternoon and the fuse that's about to blow, something inside that house is going to break in a way that no one, not René, not the commissioner, not the sisters themselves, will ever be able to fully explain. Join me in the third and final part of this story, because what happens next isn't just a brutal murder. It's a question nobody, not even the police, doctors, the public, and not even the sisters themselves, will ever be able to answer. Why? I'll appreciate. See you next time.